дня, шановні радіослухачі, з вами Радіо Зір. Події Євромайдану в Україні стали поштовхом до глобального реформування усіх державних інститутів та систем. Для того, щоб насправді об'єктивно та неупереджено оцінити роботу уряду, впровадження та функціонування реформ за справу взялися аналітики Chatham House, Лондонського Королівського інституту міжнародних відносин і однієї із найвідоміших аналітичних агенцій у світі, засновано в 1920 році. В рамках ґрунтовного дослідження «The Struggle for Ukraine» «Боротьба за Україну» було проаналізовано успіхи реформ після 2014 року, визначено проблемні зони та надано поради як Україні, так і західним партнерам, на які аспекти слід звернути увагу. Про це та інше ми поговоримо сьогодні з Джеймсом Шером, науковим співробітником Королівського інституту, та Робертом Брінклі, головою керівного комітету Chatham House, сенатором Українського католицького університету та екс-послом Великобританії в Україні. Welcome guests. First of all, I would like to admit, for those who don't know, that the Royal Institute of International Affairs, commonly known as Chatham House, is a non-profit, non-governmental organization based in London, whose mission is to analyze and promote the understanding of major international issues and current affairs. So, my first question is, how do you collect data for your projects, and can you describe the mechanism of the project work?
Thank you. Thank you for asking us to have a conversation with you. Let me talk first about the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Chatham House decided 3 years ago, in 2015, to establish the Ukraine Forum for 2 reasons. One was that we could see that over a year after the Euromaidan, the crisis in Ukraine and the conflict provoked by Russia was still going on. But most of the international media had moved on to other issues and had largely forgotten about Ukraine. And we thought it was important to have a centre in an institution like Chatham House, which was following Ukraine, analysing what was happening. The second reason was that we were conscious that a lot of the information that we were receiving in Britain, or our mass media were receiving, came from Russian sources. And we wanted to hear about the situation in Ukraine from Ukrainians. So over the last 3 years, we must have had about 100 Ukrainian politicians, civil servants, business people, civil society activists, various different people coming to our events, round tables, lectures, conferences, and helping us to have a better understanding of what is happening in Ukraine.
May I answer your question directly, but from a personal point of view, because I am one of several experts as part of the forum and one of several authors of the publication. Over the past 25 years, I have made about 150 visits to Ukraine, initially as part of an analytical centre of the British Ministry of Defence, focused exclusively on the Soviet Union. And in the course of that time, I have been privileged to establish a lot of contacts with people at many levels in and outside Ukrainian defense and security structures, also in the foreign policy establishment, in the analytical, and even in the 90s, the strong and independent analytical community in Ukraine, and in Russia also. I've had a similar span of contacts. Although sadly my grasp of the Ukrainian language is not good, my working language is Russian. So I have based most of my work and research on primary sources, either these networks of collaborators and professionals, or work that is published here and in Russia. And naturally, over the course of this time, I've built up a foundation of perceptions and insights. So that is, we've all worked in different ways, but I think other authors of the report would, in their own areas, give you a similar answer.
Mm-hmm. One of the part in your project is submitting policy recommendations and briefing government officials on the conclusions. Is there direct cooperation with political forces? Can you provide with an example when the government took into account the results of the research and began to take active measures to improve the situation in the country?
Well, I think for a think tank like Chatham House, really the whole point of its existence is that the thinking it does, the policy recommendations it makes, should have some impact in the real world, should be relevant to the real world. Otherwise, we could just be, another university department studying, forming knowledge for the sake of it. Are there cases in which what we've recommended has had a real impact? That's hard to say. Maybe James can think of an example.
Well, influence is always, particularly in countries like ours, which are very open, where there are many points of exchange and access between governments and experts. Influence is very hard to measure. All I can say, and first of all, Robert is an example of this kind of system. He was an ambassador, he was a career diplomat. He is now working in a number of private capacities based on that experience with people who have expertise in other areas who are not from those domains. So I spend a lot of time as an expert speaking often in closed sessions of senior government experts in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Ministry of Defence and other places. And we get invited back and we give presentations and we address very concrete problems and myths and misunderstandings in our countries that exist. And I stress, we're invited back and we're thanked and our work gets published and talked about, and that to me suggests that we're having some kind of influence.
Yeah, and it's a constant process of cross-fertilization. So at the Chatham House meetings, we regularly have government officials, we have journalists, we have people from universities, we have business people, and they're all learning from each other, and the sort of ideas form in this environment.
Okay, good. You want something to add?
No, that's fine.
Okay, this question was actually the introduction to the next question I have. In 2015, Chatham House presented the results of the project called the Russian Challenge, study for the period from 2000 till 2015. Among others, recommendations on response actions were provided, but representatives of the Russian parliament compared the report with the defense of the Cold War. According to Vasily Likhachev, a member of the Duma Committee of CIS Affairs, the report's goal is to misinform the power structures of Western countries and to alienate them from cooperation with Russia. How do you feel about this kind of statements?
Let me quickly jump in here, because James was one of the authors of that report. But what was very striking was that the Russian reaction to it came immediately. And that, to me, says that that report hit a nerve, it hit the spot.
And we were told by some of our professional expert colleagues in Russia privately that the report was taken seriously and not dismissed as the usual kind of infantile, stereotyped Russia bashing attacks on Russia. We were both very pleased by that reaction. But as far as this sort of Cold War label, we all know, whether we're dealing with, we're having conversations in Russia or in England, that when people don't want to deal with the substance of a problem or an argument, they start calling you names.
Yeah. Okay. Since 2005, Chatham House has a special prize, an annual award presented to the state person or organization to have made the most significant contribution to the improvement of international relations in the previous year. The first recipient of this prize in 2005 became former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko. In different years, recipients were Hillary Clinton and Melinda Gates, Bill Gates' wife and co-founder of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The question is, how do you decide who should get the prize? Is there a special commission involved in the study of the issue?
I don't know. I just know, we are all asked for opinions about it. I have been, I used to run the Russia in Eurasia program. Then and since, I was bombarded with requests from the chairman of Chatham House to nominate people. We're all asked to do this. Then there's the Chatham House Council. I don't know if they're involved in it. There's the director himself. And there's a lot of things happen in Britain. It emerges through a kind of vague process of consensus.
Well, I think there's a bit more than that. Chatham House, among other things, is a membership organisation.
I
don't know how many members there are, but it must be up into the thousands.
Yes.
And every year, the members are offered a short list of possible candidates for this prize and asked to vote. So there is a sort of democratic process within the Institute.
So everyone
who are members of the Institute. But you referred to the fact that the first prize was given to President Yushchenko, and I remember that well, because at the time I was British ambassador in Kiev, and I went back with President Yushchenko to London on his plane when he went to receive the prize. Unfortunately, that trip undid some of my best efforts to dispel a stereotype about Britain. Now, there's a stereotype which says that Britain is always foggy, Tumani Albion. And when I went with President Yushchenko on his flight, unfortunately we had to circle for 45 minutes before we were allowed to land at Heathrow. So all my efforts were in vain.
You had a research in 2016 about state of corporate corruption in Ukraine, where you were also discussing the role of the private sector in fighting corruption and set out the ways in which business can work towards eradicating corruption in the country. Earlier this month, Ukrainian Supreme Council finally signed Anticorruption court law. This is certainly a big shift and an important decision for the country. For those who haven't followed the long process of adopting this law and people who are not very interested in domestic politics, can you explain why the Anti-Corruption Court is so important?
I think one of the main reasons is that on the Euromaidan, there were very large numbers of Ukrainian people, and their main demand was for an end to corruption in Ukraine. They could see that processes and politics and business was being corrupted. They wanted to have a more transparent and fair and effective system in Ukraine. And a lot of the changes that have been made since then, there have been important changes, are trying to address that, and specifically on the issue of corruption. In 2014, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau was established. In 2016, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutors were established. And one of the issues has been, well, it's all very well to investigate and prosecute, but who is going to try these cases? Can we trust the judges who are there? And the argument was made in Ukraine that you need a special anti-corruption court with judges who've been specially chosen and vetted for their independence and probity. And the International Monetary Fund and the European Union made this a condition for granting further financial assistance, that Ukraine should establish this. So that has now been done, as you said, by the Verkhovna Rada. I think some of your civil society looking at this are still not entirely happy, and they're worried about whether the judges will be genuinely independent. But anyway, progress is made one step at a time.
I have always felt that the term corruption is too simple and convenient a term to refer to a range of related problems that basically reside in the ineffectiveness of state institutions and the complete lack of trust in these institutions. And one has to deal with this on many levels, methodically, and even if one is determined to deal with it, and you have the will and courage to deal with it, it will take a lot of time. Now, the fundamental issue of the court is a simple one. In the United Kingdom, you cannot buy justice. In Ukraine, unless you have money, you cannot get justice. And this difference, as I think, is understood by the vast majority of people in the country. And there's a related issue. Kuchma referred to it when he was president. He said judges are practically defenseless. Meaning, even if a judge is honest and says, no, I'm not going to take money, the next proposition will be a much more threatening one. Mm-hmm. And who's going to protect him? Are the security services, the procuracy going to protect him? The Ministry of Internal Affairs going to protect them? Or are they going to become part of the instrument of people threatening him? These are really serious issues, and you have to deal with them in a systematic way. And by the way, they are critical to the economic condition and future of this country. You cannot have any kind of investment unless people trust the agreement, can put trust in the agreements and contracts they sign, and trust the conditions here, and believe that agreements and obligations will be carried out and met and enforced by law. And confidence in this here in Ukraine, unfortunately, even after two revolutionary movements in the Maidan, is very low.
Now let's talk more about the reason of your coming to Kharkiv, discussing the study struggle for Ukraine. According to the results, during the last 4 years, there were much more reforms conducted in Ukraine than in the previous 22 years of independence. Can you identify the most significant and foreseeable achievements of the Ukrainian government since the day of Euromaidan?
Yes, and Chatham House is not the only body which has made this point. The leaders of the International Monetary Fund and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development have also made the same point, that there has been much more reform since 2014 than in all the years of independent Ukraine before that. So what are key results of reform since then? Well, in the banking sector, the government has had the courage to close 1/3 of the banks, to nationalise the biggest bank, Privatbank, which was being used by a big businessman for his own private purposes, to take money out. Ukraine used to depend heavily on Russia for gas supplies, and Naftogaz was notorious as a way of taking money out of the state budget of Ukraine, not giving money to it. Mm-hmm. That situation has been completely reversed. Ukraine, for the last 2 years, has not imported any gas from Russia, and Naftogaz is now contributing taxes to the budget, not taking money out of the budget of Ukraine. Immediately after the Russian annexation of Crimea and the aggression in Donbass, the Ukrainian economy was very seriously hit. The GDP fell, the currency fell, inflation went up, but your government at the time did a very successful job of stabilizing it. And as a result of that, in the last 2 years, there has been economic growth. The budget was balanced. You've introduced things which haven't been done in other countries, like Prozoro, as a transparent mechanism for the government and government bodies to procure goods and services, so everybody can see what is being bought, who's buying it, what price they're paying. Of requiring 100,000 government ministers, officials, employees to declare their income and assets. You're going further than many long-established democracies in doing this in terms of openness and transparency. So some of these are really very beneficial, very radical reforms, and there are many more.
Did you mention decentralization?
No.
No, because this is a reform whose implications, I think, are not fully understood yet, and they're very good because they are bringing accountability one step closer to ordinary people and depriving central government of certain levers of influence and control that up to now they have taken for granted. And it's one thing which is, I think, going to make these next elections rather different from earlier ones. We've always said correctly, in Ukraine we don't know the outcome of an election until it takes place, whereas in Russia we know it long before. But, you know, even so, the influence of administrative resources and of the center in Ukraine's elections has been formidable. And I think now, thanks to these reforms, it's going to be a much more fluid, we're going to see a much more fluid and open situation, which is one reason, one of several reasons I think we should not get into a state of complete despair about the results of opinion polls now. I think it's going to be like one of these races where the key horses are well in the back until you get to the last two final laps, and then certain interesting things start to happen on the track. And I think it's going to, this is the sort of thing that is likely to happen here. It could be very unpleasant, of course, but it's qualitatively different from what we've seen before.
In this case, for your opinion, which public sectors are still remain obsolete and need further reforms in Ukraine?
Well, there is a general issue here that Ukraine still has far too many businesses owned by the state. I think there are over 3,000 of them. And it's not simply that they're owned by the state, but many of them are inefficient, and that many of them are actually costing money to the state rather than bringing money to the state. So what the government is now doing, quite rightly, is the process of deciding, well, which of these really need to be owned by the state? There are some which are of strategic importance, which the state needs to control. There are many others which would do far better to be run as private businesses, with owners who are interested in having efficient and profitable businesses. And for some of those, there's a market out there, there are companies who are willing to buy them, so it's a matter of having a proper, open privatization competition where everyone can see who is paying what and the state is getting the best price. And then there'll still be some in a third category, which don't deserve to exist at all, which should just be closed.
Forgive me, I confess to the limitations of my background, but I think we underestimate the centrality of change in the defense and security sector, and I include law enforcement. I mean, I made the point many years ago that if you pay the policeman, what we used to call the milizionaire, a wage that is inconsistent with life, it is inevitable that he will cheat rather than die. If we are going to defend judges, then the institutions of law enforcement need to be irreproachable, they need to be trusted. If we have, as we do in Ukraine, still a major problem of shadow of economic structures, and of course in that opaque environment hidden Russian interests, it's not enough that the security services have much of this information about how this works, but that information can then be relied upon to bring people to justice and not used as a political tool by this vested interest or that in the country. when you have the basic defense and security institutions of the state being used as tools of private agents and foreign countries, you're threatening the security of the state. And Ukraine has not systematically addressed this problem. I think it's vital.
Will it ever be possible to get rid of the Soviet way of thinking for Ukrainians? Because in my opinion nowadays it's one of the main reasons for delaying the process of reform in the country and their acceptance in public discourse.
I think you're absolutely right. We have to take into account how people have lived much of their lives, the history of the 20th century, that attitudes and mentality once formed can take a long time to change. I was in Germany at the time of German unification in 1990, and I remember Chancellor Kohl saying at that time that it won't take long to dismantle the Berlin Wall, but it will take a generation to dismantle the wall in people's heads.
Yeah.
And I think we all have to understand that attitudes which have formed over generations will not suddenly disappear in a year or two. That it may be desirable to make changes, but we've got to be realistic about how long it takes.
There's bad news and good news in my view here. The bad news is that the Soviet mentality is not the only dangerous mentality. The criminal mentality is worse. The instincts and impulses and habits of mind that were bred in the 1990s by the whole process of collapse, the unraveling of the economy, the sudden loss of status by whole classes of people. This is part of what created Putin, as much as the KGB created Putin. This is, I think, in many ways a more immediate problem. The Soviet mentality is more generational. I'm not saying that you don't have to do something about it, but as time goes on it becomes less of a problem. I'm struck by the fact that people we know and meet who are free of that mentality are totally free of it, which is encouraging. It's not as if it infects everything, but the criminal mentality does not work like that. It's contagious. There are people we meet who are just wonderful examples of what this country can be like when they're 20 years old. But when they're 30 years old and they're working in business or they're in parliament, what kind of people are they then? What instincts do they need to survive? How can you participate in a political process where you need to find $3 million to be in a proper place on a party list to get elected? This is a more insidious problem to me.
Okay, got it. And my last question is,
Sure.
You pay a lot of attention to positive changes in different spheres in the study. Can the results of this project become a driving force in Ukraine's long-term process of European integration?
I hope that there are some people in Ukraine who will read our report. It's been translated into Ukrainian. I hope they'll think that some of the ideas are useful, but of course it's up to Ukrainians. They will decide which policies are useful, which are not, in the circumstances here. That's not for outsiders to say. On the process of European integration, and this is clearly what Ukrainians want. They've been saying this ever since independence. Every president of Ukraine has made it a major goal for the country. It's been endorsed by an ever-increasing majority of the people in the country as the way to go. So I think nobody can be in any doubt about Ukraine's strategic course, but it's going to take time. And these things don't just fall into place one year after another. And you don't just knock on the door of the European Union and say, I want to join, please let me in. There's a long way to go. We've just been talking about the Soviet mentality, about making Ukraine a truly European country, which behaves in a European way, and then I think you'll find it's much easier. But already the process of integration is well underway. I can remember when I was ambassador, we talked about one day Ukraine becoming a member of the World Trade Organization. You did that, 2008. One day you might get an association agreement with the European Union. Did that, 2014. The association agreement offers fantastic opportunities for Ukraine to take part in the European single market, the biggest single market in the world, and trade freely in that market. Britain is about to leave the European Union. We're in a democratic process. We've voted to leave, and we're now working out how we do that. So both of our countries, United Kingdom and Ukraine, are then going to be in Europe, but not in the European Union. But I hope also having very close and deep partnerships with the European Union.
Let me go back to one of the original points that I believe Robert made. The Ukraine Forum and the report is addressing two audiences. We are addressing a Western audience, first of all, and it's urgent that we do that, because what we want to do in the West is change the conversation. There are very negative stereotypes and images about Ukraine in the West. And it's a separate issue how they got there. But the view that Ukraine is a basket case, that any money invested there is throwing good money after bad, that there's no point in helping these people, they are useless, that it is chaotic. All of this. These are very deep stereotypes, and it is difficult to struggle against them. And that is a large part of what we are doing, and it's hard work. But I know we have been making a lot of progress. Where I think I want to change the discussion inside Ukraine is get people to understand that even if you get an association agreement, well, Radi Boga, very good. A formal status, an agreement, a piece of paper is not going to change the realities of life here. It doesn't matter that this association agreement provides opportunities of 80% of the EU membership acquis. If you don't know how to take advantage of them, and you don't have institutions that are able to work in this environment. And that is why some Ukrainian experts have said that if we have in an unreformed economy the implementation of a free trade area, it's actually going to damage us because our institutions don't know how to operate in this way. This is a real problem. So we're trying to focus minds on what needs to change in practice and what Ukrainians need to do if they are interested in this.
Okay, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
З вами було Радіо Азір. Почуємося.